le pido a Erin Mazursky subir al escenario. Erin Mazursky es licenciada en Servicio Exterior de Georgetown University y cuenta con un certificado en Liderazgo, Organización y Acción de Harvard. Tiene experiencia en consultoría y emprendimiento social. Actualmente es presidenta y cofundadora en Rhize, una red global que ayuda a líderes a construir una participación sostenida y activa en los movimientos sociales que cambian al mundo.
Buenas noches. If you need the translation, feel free to go get it. And I apologize that I could not speak to you in Spanish. It's been many years since mi fluencia era bueno, entonces esto es en inglés. But I tried to kind of incorporate this Spanish into the presentation, and so hopefully it's clear. I'm very excited to be here, and really appreciate Sandrine and Erica for inviting me here. We've talked a lot today, and I've been very impressed by the presenters talking about participation and the need for more participation in society and the responsibility that we have. And I've agreed with all of it, and it's been a really great lead up to what I want to talk to you today about, which is social movements and sort of how all of this active participation winds up actually really transforming the society that we live in. And so just a little bit about myself, and I know Sandrine gave me an introduction, but it's really what we're talking about is power and how we find not just our own power, but we find our collective power within society. And so I was a student activist that just kind of became addicted to the idea of helping other people find their agency, and really from a young age was fortunate enough to be able to see the power of movements and collective action, and was able to take that, what I'd learned in my work abroad. And I've, over the last dozen years or so, traveled to about 25 countries, or worked with movements in 25 different countries, and about 30 different movements, and through that have been able to see not just the differences place to place, and obviously in each context there's always differences, and there's always challenges, but what I was able to see was actually really common struggles and similarities around what makes movements work and also what makes movements fail. And so that's really where I'm coming from today, is from a perspective of cultural diversity and an appreciation, and that we have to adapt these best practices to our own context, but that movements in and of themselves are, in my opinion, and this is what drives me, really one of the most powerful sources for social change that we have access to, and we all have access to it. So we live in the era of movements right now. Over the last decade, there have been more movements that have cropped up than in the last 3 decades combined. A lot of this has to do with technology and access to information and ability to really communicate with each other. But it's also created, while it creates a lot of hope, it's also created another crisis, which is also the era of leadership crisis. And I think we're seeing this in acute forms all over the world right now, including my own country. And this isn't just, about dictators or the rise of really exclusionary, conservative, right people, but also just people losing faith in the institutions that these leaders represent, feeling like they don't represent us anymore. They're not able to respond to our needs anymore. And this leadership crisis isn't just at the top, obviously. It extends to institutions throughout civil society. On on balance, youth, and actually in all age groups, and not just youth, but youth most acutely, are less engaged with formal institutions than ever before. In Europe alone, its participation in political parties has gone down 13%. And that's actually really a global trend, is that we're all kind of getting away from these formal institutions that we no longer feel really represent us or can respond to us or represent our values. And so it's a crisis of leadership at the top. And when we look at how we create social change, the same is also true. For the last many, many decades, we've basically just been told how we can create social change. It starts with voting, right? You're a citizen if you vote, and that's your civic duty. But it's also really extended to technology as well. The way that we participate is that we get emails or we get things on Facebook and tell us to participate. So it's all very centralized and directive. And then we've got sort of our large NGOs oftentimes that, again, are the ones that create the campaigns and then ask you to participate, which is fine, except people aren't participating. So clearly, there's a disconnect. People aren't participating in formal institutions, but they are participating in movements. And so both, so that indicates, that we need to really transform civil society so that we can create more opportunities for movements to flourish if that's where more participation is happening. And it's not just because that's where more participation is happening, it's because there's more potential for change even with these structures, and I'll explain why. So let's do this through a story, a story of two movements. So 2011 was an incredible year for movements. It really, I think, put it on the map for all of us that, we're in a new age, we're in a new era where these popular movements and popular protest movements are really popping up around the world. And I think the revolutions in the Middle East, the series of revolutions, are really telling in terms of the trends that we're experiencing now. But you look at really two countries that happened side by side, Tunisia and Egypt, and they had very similar looking revolutions and actually very different results. And they're really different results that we couldn't have predicted necessarily then, although I think we probably could have. But now it's really telling sort of what the results of those revolutions are. So that it's telling a couple things. One is that not all movements are created equal. Not all movements are inherently successful just because they've been able to get a lot of people out on the streets. What's the difference between Tunisia and Egypt? Well, Tunisia definitely escorted their dictator out the door, but they actually very quickly then engaged in a deep democratic political process where they did not exclude their leadership, but they actually brought everyone to the table in order to create a vision for what was next. Egypt, on the other hand, the really courageous youth that organized that movement, really had one thing that they were looking for, and it was the exit of their dictator. What we've seen is that the problem with that is that the exit of one guy doesn't really take down the entire system in which everyone's been oppressed. And after a series of events, you could argue that Egypt's actually worse off today than it was in 2011. And so I want to talk a little bit about how both of these things happen and how we can create more Tunisias and hopefully prevent more Egypts. So we have, part of the problem is just our comprehension of what leadership is in and of itself. We think of leadership as, again, the people at the top. And even some of the most seasoned activists that I have the privilege to work with are constantly thinking about how can we make that guy do what we want. it's always about like the guy that's in power, and it's usually a guy, right, who we want to convince to give us our rights. And so the power, yes, comes from people, but it really winds up depending on one person, couple people's decision. And we think about it as really us versus them. They're at the top, you know, we did elect them, they have to do this for us. Sometimes we didn't elect them. And they need to do this for us. And we see, you know, it's us, and then there's these institutions and these laws, and then there's these leaders that really govern us. But what if we thought about government as actually just one pillar of society? And instead of seeing it as people, institutions, leaders, we saw it as actually all of us are a part of many of these institutions. You know, I go to the doctor, and I got a public education, and I consume a lot of media and culture. I am either consenting and playing a role in all of those systems, or I'm protesting and I'm playing an alternative role. And the idea is that, you know, our leaders are propped up by the people. It's not just these immovable institutions that can't change. It's actually that the government is one part of this, and there's leaders, including all of us, in all of these different sectors, in all of these different pillars that make up our society. And so if we change our mind frame, our mindset from, you know, it's us and then it's all of them, to we're actually a part of each and every one of these pillars, and we are either therefore complicit with what's happening in the status quo, or we're going to find ways to change each one of these institutions, is really what's going to determine all of our futures. So, to bring the point home, it's not just about electing the right people, although that is absolutely a big part of it. It's also about making sure that we are teaching the right curriculum, that our universities are structured in a way that is fair for more access, that there's enough medicines in our hospitals and access for all types of people. And there's all types of ways of changing these systems from within. You're a lawyer, you're a doctor, you're a technologist, you're a musician. Everyone really plays a role in this. So this really helps to change the mindset of, you know, citizens as really voters, and I mean citizens largely in the not legal frame, because many people don't have the right to vote in many of our countries, but, you know, citizens aren't just people who are voting. They're actually active participants, everyday participants in our societies. And what, you know, so if we think of ourselves as participants, we start to think about our power differently. We've been thinking about it this way, but if maybe we just, you know, start stepping off the plank, things can really change. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about one of the movements that I've worked with over the last year, called New Uganda, which is actually a new name. I have gone to Uganda many times over the last 5 years or so, and in July of last year I noticed a shift, that it had really gone from one or two campaigns that were being run by their opposition political leaders to different activists trying different campaigns, and it was clear that there was something different and ripe that could really start the flow towards democracy. And so we had a workshop and we had a training, and we brought some of our Kenyan activists there as well, so that there could be exchange. And we, you know, and we got there actually just in time, because the week before we got there in October, this effort called the Democracy Alliance had completely failed. So in Uganda, there's only been opposition parties for 10 years. Museveni, the president, has been president for 30 years now, and just got elected to his whatever in 6th term. So we'll be in power for 35 years by the time the next election rolls around, and had only really allowed opposition parties for about 10 years. The problem is that these opposition parties have had the same leaders in them for the last 10 years. It hasn't changed. And there was this huge Herculean effort over the course of 2015 to get these opposition leaders to unite, because part of the problem was that there were like 10 opposition leaders all leading different movements, all leading different political parties, and they were actually causing more fraction, which meant inevitably Museveni would get elected again, because they're electing 6 different people versus 1. So they tried, very hard to get the opposition leaders to agree to one leader, one person who could really take on the current president. And a lot of effort was poured in, a lot of money was poured in from international institutions as well, and it completely fell apart at the beginning of October of 2015. And the elections are in February of 2016. So really very demoralized, these activists from actually very different organizations. There's an organizer there who organizes all of the taxi drivers, another who organizes farmers in the north. Big actions for people to take. They weren't sort of helping, they were creating conversations, but they weren't actually leading people through a process to really ultimately win. And so we were able to help them think about, how do you create these short-term wins for your longer-term goal? So that's just an example of another example of that. And finally, all of this kind of comes together into a cycle. You're building support, you're creating structure for more people to be able to participate, and then you're helping people take more action that creates more support, that creates more organization. And your end result is strong communities, really important bases of democracy, so not, more voters again, but more democracy, and an ongoing struggle. So, we've been able to see a struggle around civil rights in the US for, 80 years at this point, if not longer. They've been working on this for hundreds of years. And that's what we're going for, is continued struggle, because it's probably never over. But you can create really big wins in the process. Create ultimate progress. And, ultimately with the work that I do, we envision a world of just connected movements that are learning from each other, of communities that are working in these ways all around the world, so that we can evolve the way that we create movements and create much more inclusive societies. So thank you.
What is your opinion on the political use of social movements by right-wing politicians, like is happening in Brazil? Don't you think that some social movements can also damage democracy?
Yes. I mean, the US is also experiencing this. Germany, France, we're seeing the rise of these right-wing movements all over the world right now. But I also think it proves the power of movements. And my critique of especially like a lot of the American left is that we're not organized well. We're actually doing a really bad job of organizing ourselves and creating counterweights to these crazy people. And it is really difficult. And what I think is different about what we're trying to create than a lot of these movements is that we're not creating populist movements. We're creating actually really smart relational movements where people are talking to each other and related to each other. The Donald Trump movement and what's happening in Brazil is really, it's like this populism that just continues to take advantage of people who are most vulnerable, and really exploit that. And what we're trying to do with I think the movements that we want to support and build is not just create populist movements that everyone's going to support, but actually creating those relationships. You know, the LGBT movement, again, in the US has been incredibly successful because, you know, now everybody has someone that they know who's gay, right? Like, it created this relationship and this really mind change around social norms. What these right-wing movements are doing is really just brainwashing people and actually trying to just pretend like facts don't exist and, you know, really use people's suffering as a political advantage. So yes, I mean, it is a net neutral tool, is movement building, but I think that we can make them better. And I think that they're actually the only way that we can counter a lot of these. It's the only counterweight, right? Like, how else are we going to solve this? It's really a battle of people at this point. And if you need any more proof that investment in this type of thing is important, the Koch brothers, I think we know who they are, you know, Walmart, people, they fund everyone in the Republican Party, just opened their own organizing university. So they're catching on that this is important, and we're really lagging behind. So in my opinion, the only way to do this is to organize better.
The second question is a bit long. When we reorient responsibility from institutions to ourselves as participants, aren't we failing in taking into account the structures that force the consent of the status quo?
Yes. I mean, yes and no. I mean, the point is that we're not saying forget you institutions, it's about us. It is about an important relationship. And so I think this is something that that gets misunderstood, is that I actually think it's bad, and this is why we are seeing this incredible polarization in like all these countries around the world, is that people are just saying, forget this, it's just about us, or forget that, it's just about us, and we're not actually working together. And so really successful movements, and I've actually done some reading about movements, particularly in Latin America, and one of the speakers was talking about this as well, is that actually there are rich traditions here of movements really creating alternative structures. But those alternative structures are really key, because then those are the structures that wind up getting adopted by our institutions. And so, in my opinion, it's actually a really important relationship where movements need to find their power, create alternatives to what exists, but then we have to hold governments accountable to say, this is working for us, and you need to make this work because this is what's working for us. And that's really how we are able to create a lot of that social change.